And you'll see that as we get to the end. So I'm going to be hopping back and forth, so don't worry about that. So to begin with some acknowledgements, as Madonna said, a lot of the study was funded by NDEP and the Tahoe water suppliers, and Ingrid was the administrator of the grant. But the first part of what I'll be talking about tonight was actually the result of a lot of work over a lot of years, funded by a lot of groups whose names I can remember most of their names, but I'll probably forget somebody if I try to list them all. But lots of people were involved. For this particular study, I just wanted to point out Andrea Hoya, who was doing a PhD, working with my colleague Francisco Rueda in Spain. They were doing a lot of the modeling work, and Michael Anderson at UC Riverside was doing the actual formal risk assessment. Okay, so 3 things we're going to try to cover. So, first of all, this concept of temperature stratification. 2 big words. Really, all it means is in summer and a lot of the year, top of the lake gets warm. That's why we like to swim in it. It's less dense than the cold water at the bottom, which means, the lake, the water at the top likes to stay at the top, the water at the bottom stays at the bottom. It makes the lake very stable. If we take that and we combine it with the wind, like it was really windy today, together they actually produce some very complex interactions. And we're going to look at some of those before we talk about the actual modeling work that was done here. Lake motions are important. So these, temperature stratification, the wind affect the motions. Why are motions important? Who really cares which way the water's going, north to south, east to west? Doesn't matter. Yes, it does. Because it's the currents, it's the motions that transport everything in the water. Pathogens, which was the purpose of this study, could be transported from beaches to water intakes. A contaminant from a boat that's sunk, or from a truck that runs off the road, or whatever, is transported from where it's released to anywhere in the lake. The spread of herbicides, if they were used in the lake, it would be controlled by this. And invasive species, when they reproduce and their larvae are released into the water, where they end up is again controlled by lake motions. In the case of Lake Tahoe, we know, I said almost nothing, and I underlined it and I put it in bold to emphasize it. Almost nothing is known. Actually, in 45 minutes tonight, I will be telling you everything that is known. So that's it, 45 minutes worth is all we have. Okay, important concept. A lake is more than a hole in the ground filled with water. Lots of these complex interactions taking place. These are the famous pothole lakes you find in North Dakota and Saskatchewan and all those prairie states out a long way from here. And they're more complex than just a hole in the wall filled with water. And Tahoe is a long way from that. It's very deep, it's very convoluted, it's in an extreme climate. Lots of things are going to be affecting water motions here. Okay, so wind. This is a prime driver of motions. It's not the only one, but it's the prime one. So on the map on the right there, and just all those little labels represent different wind stations we have around the lake. Actually, that map is a little bit old, so some of them, there are actually some other ones, and their names have changed to protect the innocent. But that's what we need that data. We need that data to understand what's happening in the lake, and as you'll see in a minute, we need them to run models. What I'm going to show you now is an interpolation of the wind over the whole lake, just based on measurements taken of these wind stations around the lake and some on the lake. Okay, so it's not going to start moving just quite yet. I guess this doesn't show up on the screen. Okay. Okay, I think you all understand the little white arrows. They're showing the wind direction. Okay, so here the arrows are pointing down. In this part of the lake, the wind is going from north to south. Here it's going from east to west. Here it's doing something a little bit different. So the arrows are easy to understand. The colors are something that's called vorticity. You don't need to know what vorticity is, defined by, in terms of velocities in the line. What it actually is sort of the way the wind turns, okay? So red, positive numbers, represents counterclockwise motions. So what this is saying is the winds are producing a counterclockwise there. The blue represents sort of clockwise, and here it's counterclockwise. So what you're going to see when I start this playing, as you'll see time marching an hour at a time, what you'll see is how dynamic these winds are. We all think, oh, Tahoe, wind comes from the southwest. It does a lot of the time, but it comes from the southwest when you measure it at the airport, down here. When you're over here or over there, because of the action of the mountains and the valleys and everything, the wind is very different. Okay. Now I have to... I've got this little spinning wheel of death. Oh yeah, that's exactly the response. It's changing. It's getting up 15 minutes at a time. The wind is highly variable. As I said before, it's the winds that are driving the motions of the lake. And so it's different. It's different every day, every hour. This is giving the maximum wind speed, 5 meters per second, 2 meters per second. It's changing. I mean, the details of it are not that important to look at. Okay. Number 2, going back to this idea of temperature. So I think we're all comfortable with the idea that cold water is dense, warm water is less dense, and so the warm water is at the top, cold water is at the bottom. So if this is let's say a box of water, it's warm at the top, cold at the bottom. If nothing was happening, these colors would all be horizontal, just be like a stripe panel. Okay. What's been happening here is that the wind has been blowing. The wind has been blowing from this side across there. So what that does is it pushes the warm water over to that side. It's not going to go all the way to the bottom because it's too light, but it just pushes up on that side, and to take its place, this water comes. Okay?
Sure.
2 people. I've doubled my average.
What time of year is this describing?
This is any time of year when there's a temperature stratification, which would be pretty much almost all year, except for 2 weeks in the March. But it's strongest in summer. So it's strongest from about May through November. All right. So here we are. This has been pushed there. Wind stops, dies down. It's night. What's going to happen?
Level up.
And it goes back the other way. And then it goes back, it starts moving up and down, up and down. Now, I can see Laurel is there looking very skeptical. Yeah. This guy does this to me every time. It's real. Okay, it's not just a box that I'm playing with here. It's real. So this is data from Lake Tahoe. This is, again, these are temperatures. 49 degrees Fahrenheit is the red, and 42 is the blue. This is going down 500 feet. So this was an instrument we used a couple of years ago. It looks like a submarine, and what it does is it zigzags up and down across the lake. Go one way, go back and forth across the lake, taking measurements of temperature and lots of other things. And so this is a snapshot. This is just one of its transects across the lake. This is the west shore. This is just near Sunnyside, north of Homewood. And this would be like Incline Village. The wind had been blowing west to east. We're seeing exactly what we saw in that little box. All the warm water is tilted up here, everything is tilted. When the wind stops, it would rock back and forth. Okay, so let's say we can't afford to run submarines back and forth all the time. What we can afford to do, and what we do a lot of, is we put instruments in the lake. We anchor them on the bottom, and we have a rope that goes up with a buoy below the surface. So it's taut, it's vertical. And on that rope, we put instruments that measure temperature. So they sit at certain depths, measuring temperature. So what would they measure if they're sitting here and this sort of thing is going on? You know, if it's sitting here, it's measuring this blue water, whatever temperature that is, but a few hours later, as this tilts down, it would start measuring the yellow water, and then the red water, and then it would go back and it would measure blue stuff. So it would, what you would see there, expect to see, is this sort of oscillation. Guess what you're going to see next? Oh my. All right, so this is, again, Homewood, 360 feet of water. This goes from August 1 to November 1, so that partly answers Lazar's question there. And what you're seeing are these oscillations, going up and down. And we're interested tonight in the surface, but these things are happening everywhere. I mean, this is down 360 feet. So there's motions everywhere, not just next to where the wind is blowing. So this dashed line, this is a depth of 16 meters. This is the depth of a lot of the intakes, the water intakes around Lake Tahoe. So you can see there, well, for example, if we look at this time of year, part of the time, you see that red color is going by the dashed line. What that's saying is that at that depth, surface water is suddenly going down to 16 meters depth. Water that you've all been swimming in and having fun and playing around, and maybe little children are having accidents. I mean, that's a worry. And then sometimes you're getting water from deeper down coming up. Okay. So, motions, one thing we can do is we can measure velocity. We can do that. It's not that hard. The equipment's a little expensive, but you can do it. So this is such an instrument. It has these three like eyes there. These are acoustic transducers. It basically sends out sound. And it uses the Doppler shift principle that you all learned and loved in high school. Or possibly not. And what it can do is that it can tell us what the velocity is in the water next to this instrument, and actually all the way up. There are other instruments showing the frame we had actually very close to Tahoe Keys a few years ago, and it has different instruments for measuring velocity. And this is the sort of signal you would see. Velocity is sort of shown in centimeters per second there. So the top is 10 centimeters per second, that's about 4 inches per second. And you can see two things. One is it's highly variable. Number two, it's never zero. And this is this is a month of data. It never just stops. I mean, we may look at the lake and it's calm and placid, but it's moving. And part of the reason it's moving is back to that wave going back and forth. The wind has stopped blowing, but the effect of the wind is sort of captured in that rocking back and forth. All right. So those measurements are really useful. It tells us exactly what's happening at that point where the instrument is. But if you had to paint a picture of velocity in the lake based on measurements at one point, it's really hard. It could be very different somewhere else in the lake. So it's another kind of instrument. These are called drogues. They're like these big giant sails that we put underwater, and we attach them with a very thin line to a cell phone or a GPS. The water currents push the sail around, and the GPS just goes along for the ride, and it tells us every minute, every 5 minutes, where it is. And so what we see is where the currents are carrying these. So it's not telling us, it's not giving us the record of velocity at one point, but it's showing us what the whole field is doing. Okay. So, this is what you're going to see now are the results of releasing 4 of these drogues. We release them, I guess, across the middle here. What you're seeing at the top is the wind speed. So again, it's variable, and this is, we're going from day 263 to 2, so you're going to see 10 or 14 days of data. So wind speed, wind direction is not that important for this. Red, blue, green, and whatever. The other colors are the drogues you'll see, and these are showing their velocities, the speeds of the drogues. And some of them, 30 centimeters a second, a foot per second. That's pretty high. Even when it's lower, it's still 6 inches a second. Do the math, well, you will see how quickly these things actually move. There they go. And this red line is showing you time. Look at that blue guy. And he's got a mind of his own. The thing is, this one is now close to where it started off, but it's not doing the same thing. The wind has changed. It's doing something else. They disappear sometimes because we lose the signal. Likes Glenbrook.
Dead Man's Point.
Dead Man's Point. Yeah, and then there was this big storm and we lost communication with all of them, and then they all popped back. Did you see how fast that went down?
I got money on blue.
Yeah, that's right. That's what happens when you give a talk on the matter. Everybody starts betting on the outcome. Okay, so you get the idea. These things are moving.
I think it's going to go crazy too.
Okay, so that gives us a great picture of what's happening out in the body of the lake. Actually, let me go back to that. Actually, I don't want to replay it. But based on a lot of studies like this, based on satellite data we've seen, what we've noticed, what we've learned, is that we often have a big gyre in the north. Not always there, it's often there, going counterclockwise, similar to that counterclockwise wind we have up there. And then we have another one in the south doing that. And sometimes we have another one down here doing the opposite thing. And that's often the case in the middle of the lake. So the question is, well, what happens closer to it? So this is a picture taken not far from here. This was about 5 or 6 years ago when the Asian clans were sort of at their worst in Marla Bay. And what you're seeing here, this green color, is the algae that were produced by the really heavy nutrient load from the excretion from these clams. And this is sort of one of the reasons there has been a lot of interest and a lot of desire to try to control invasive species, because they produce these other effects that nobody wants. So we were working on clams at the time, and so we were very interested in, well, one question was, well, why Marla Bay? Why, I mean, at that point, in fairness, they were sort of in quite a few places along here. But Marla Bay was where they had a lot of them. So we decided, well, don't know a whole lot about currents in the near shore. Let's release some drogues. Actually, we chose to release them off Tahoe Keys for no real reason. Put them all close together and see what happens. Put my money on blue again.
One more time.
No, one more time. Look at him.
He's seen this before, so he knew.
I know. So you get tires going, it's like 2 days between. Look at Red.
Yeah, straight to the
Red loves Mala Bay. Went in, looked around, and said,
Come back, come back.
not so bad, have another look. I mean, again, the water motions are such that there's this trapping zone. These guys stick together and they go very quickly, in about half a day from the east across to the west. The green one is run aground. All right. And this is just an example of what the data looks like from one of these. This is the one that was in Mala Bay, went to Mala Bay, and this was the exact path that I followed. It seems to be going. It's actually great watching this because you sort of see up to there, and you think, oh, I wonder if it's going to turn now. And you can waste a lot of time. Only another 5 minutes for another data point. So, yeah, it's like cats on YouTube. Okay, I'm not going to show you this. It's the same sort of thing. Okay, so we've got current meters, tell us a lot of information at one point. We have drogues that start to give us an overall picture of currents on a lake-wide scale. But with the drogues, you know, we only have as many as we put in. We know what the tracks are, where we put them in. To really get a great measure, we need hundreds of them at the same time. So the way we try to do that is we use models. What we're doing here is solving very complex equations on very large computers. So this is, and I should add my caveat, never trust the result from a model. Never.
I'm writing that down.
Yeah, underline it. Never trust the result from a model unless you stop writing. Unless it's being compared with data. Anybody can write a model and it gives nice results and you get some fancy graphics and everybody thinks, oh, that's great. It looks so real and plausible. But it may look real, may look plausible, may not be real. So the result, what I'm not going to show you tonight are the years and years of calibration and validation using the model in different lakes. It's not perfect, it's an approximation tool, but it gives us a lot of information. What this grid represents are the little blocks we have to divide the world up into when we model something. So in this case, for the case of Tahoe, we have 200 by 200 meter grids. So each of these little boxes is 200 meters on a side, and in the vertical, they may be as small as 1 meter, and as you get down deeper and deeper, they get bigger in order to save computational resources. It's like 1.5 million grids. The model does its little thing, and it tries to simulate the world evolving every 5 seconds. So this takes a long time. So to run the model to see what happens over 1 month may take 4 or 5 days to run on the computers we have. Bigger computers, it would be a lot faster. Okay. So, some of you have seen this, but you will, if you haven't seen it before, you will see why people never tire of seeing it. Oh, so what are you seeing? Okay, before we run it. Okay, so this is the lake divided up into 4 quadrants, and we've done the equivalent of putting floating tennis balls with different colors in each quadrant. So what these represent are particles, let's say, being moved around by the surface currents in the lake. So think of these as drogues. Instead of 3 or 4 drogues being released, we now have 1,000 drogues being released. And so as you'll see them move, you'll see it over about a 2.5 day period, you will really get a sense of how the whole lake moves. I hope. And there'll be a quiz afterwards. Dear. See how it's sort of pulsating? Why do you think it's pulsating?
Boat traffic.
Day and night, day and night.
No, no.
Yeah.
Well, yes and no.
Wind.
It's the wind.
Yeah.
And during the day, the wind usually fires up in the afternoon, then it calms down. I'm gonna play it again. Okay, so what I was talking about before, I said we have this gyre in the north, you see that? We have this gyre in the south, and then we have this other one that sort of comes and goes, and we have stuff happening there in the middle. Let me just stop that. One thing I want you to notice, and well, last night I could say you were the first people in the world that have ever heard this, and you're now the second group in the world who have ever heard this model has a major shortcoming. And if you look closely, all these points along the very edges, around there, if you look in the remaining time, hardly moving at all. So let's continue it. And look at now, not at the center, but at the edges. Okay. Something's happening. I mean, the model does a great job in the middle, based on the data. So the fact that there seems to be a problem at the edges is a huge problem if we want to represent the nearshore. And certainly for the work we were doing here, that was the focus. NDEP and the water suppliers didn't really care that much about the gyres in the middle of the lake. They wanted to know what was happening where their intakes were in 16 meters of water, maybe 100 meters offshore. Okay, so let's focus on this point here, or this general area. And here's a cross-section of what that looks like. I just made this up, this is amazing. Well, this is a 50-meter contour, and these squares are 200 meters. So just think of 200 meters from shore. Depth gets to about 100 meters in some locations. There's a little shelf, and then it drops off quicker. Right now, with the model result I showed you that has these 200-meter grids, which is amazing for a lake of this size, a grid cell at the edge looks like that, which is saying that one grid cell is representing, trying to represent everything happening there where the water changes from almost no depth to maybe 100 meters depth. So it sort of does its best. It's it'll be sort of half that width. Well, I don't know. It can't do a very good job. It's just impossible. So we have a problem. Problem? Sorry, a challenge. We have no problems. We just have challenges. And the challenge is right now, what we had was this coarse grid model. This is just saying the water depth, the bathymetry around the lake. And our model does a great job in 99% of that, except right near the edge. If we could overcome our problem if we just used a smaller grid. Right? Yeah, just make the grid 100 meters or 50 meters or 20 meters. But to do that over the whole lake is just impossible. We don't have a computer big enough. It would take too long. Because every time you make the grid smaller, the time steps have to go from 5 seconds to half a second to it just doesn't work. So what we did was we divided the shoreline into little segments. Within these little segments, we put tiny little grids, and then ran this model, and this model told us what was happening at the edges here, and then we could pass that information to this very fine grid model. It's sort of like coarse grids work here, fine grids work there. This is where it's like a relay race. They pass off the information. So what we have now in the near shot is something like this. We're going from within this 200-meter grid, we now have 20-meter grids. Much, much finer. Okay, so What I'm going to show you now is, this is the southeast corner of the lake, is just a typical model result of what you would see in the southeast corner. These purple lines, this is the thick one is the 100-meter contour, and the one closest to shore is the 20-meter contour, 70 feet of water. So this is, all this, most of this area would have been in one grid cell before. Now we have lots of grid cells in here. What you're actually seeing, what these little lines represent, is how far water travels in 2 hours in that direction. They're called streamlines. So anyway, what you'll see is pretty, well, it's pretty interesting. I'll let you judge. So this is hours going by at the top. Once again, it's extremely variable. It's changing all the time. And sometimes you can see something coming up there. You've got the currents coming here. Mile Bay, you're often getting this recirculating cell. You have this eddy there. Anybody been kayaking up there? You seen that eddy? Maybe it's not there. It's a model. But that's the sort of data that we need more of. If you go either side of this 100-meter contour, the velocities are very different. So this near shore and the pelagic, the offshore, behave very different. So we can watch this go on and on.
So Jeff, for the small grids, what is the confidence level when you're talking about maybe only 3 to 5 meters depth? I mean, is that again?
The depth is, say, 1 meter. So your first grid next to shore would be 1 meter.
Right, and further up, are you going down?
Further down, let's say when it's 5 meters of water, you'd have 5 1-meter grids, vertical grids.
Yeah.
And then once you're away from shore, then you may start stretching out your grids to 2 meters or 3 meters. But, okay. All right, so let's get to the, so that's the model we used. That was a very long introduction. That was the model we used because, and Madonna mentioned at the beginning that there was this 2008 study done by Black and Veatch, and we did some work for that, primarily because they needed water velocities to run the risk assessment model to see what the pathogen exposure would be. We said at the time, well, these aren't going to be good estimates, but Black and Veatch said, even a wrong answer is better than nothing. So I was happy with that. They had to have something. So I'm not sure how wrong it was, but it was they had a velocity to put in there based on the best available information. And sometimes you have to do that. What's changed now is the best available information is better. Okay. So what we did, we created 2 months of summer currents. So we're primarily focusing on the summer because that's the swim season. Most people are swimming, most pathogens are being shed there. So Michael Anderson did the whole risk assessment and the good news based on that. And I'm not going to go into detail on this at all, is that essentially for water, well, we looked at 2 intakes, Kingsbury Grade and Edgewood. Essentially, what we got was the risk of Cryptosporidium infection was 0.001 infections per 10,000 people per year. So that's the risk you took when you drank that water. You should have told you that before. EPA target is 1 infection per 10,000 per year. So from the point of view of compliance, this is 1,000 times better than compliance levels, and that's great. But it's largely due, as Madonna said, to having UV and having ozonation and the like. And that's great. So I'm not going to go into detail on how those numbers were arrived at, other than it's good. We were able to use the model to look at some other really interesting things. And so we played around with the model and added some new models to it. Essentially what we added was model for the release of pathogens from people, how they're transported, that's what we just saw, occurrence, and then the survival of pathogens, because pathogens don't live forever. UV radiation will tend to make them, kill them. Temperature will eventually kill them too. And so we just played around with this model, and we used a different water intake. We used Round Hill there. And what you'll see, what this taught us was how these actual water motions, how they interact with the pathogen contaminant risk. And we were asked to look at what would happen. This was not a definitive study at all. What would happen if there was a release of something from the area of the Tahoe Keys? Would that reach this area of interest or not? So I'm going to show you a little bit of that too. All right, so these are just about 6 or 7 screen grabs of the velocity. So this is Kingsbury grade and Edgewood, or the other way around. Which is which?
Kingsbury's GID.
Yeah.
Edgewood is to the left.
Yeah,
Edgewood.
Edgewood's closer to California.
Okay, you're right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So that's where they're located, and I'm just going to zip through these to just show you once again conditions, velocities change all the time. So this is July 28th at 4 in the afternoon. This is July 28th, 11 at night. July 29th, 7 at night. July 31 to later in the day. So, the conditions are just highly variable. The direction, the strength, what have you. Okay. This is the area we're looking at. These yellow areas are the beach areas. This is the approximate location of the Round Hill intake. Okay, so this is just the result. I'm not going to describe it all. This is just the nice part at the end, I think. Okay, so this is showing, again, just the current speed. This is model. This isn't measured. This is what the model tells us right at the inlet. When water is taken in at Round Hill, this is the water in that grid cell. This is its velocity, at 16 meters, that's at the inlet, and the blue is at the surface. And you see that they go up and down, the same sort of velocity range. Sometimes the surface water is very different than the bottom one. Doesn't matter. Okay, this next one is particularly interesting. So all these pink circles, they represent pathogens arriving at the intake. And I should make the point that of all the pathogens released from those beach areas, we're talking about, let me back up. Something like less than 1%, less than 0.1% of the water that enters there has come from the beach areas within 24 hours. So it's not as if there's a direct line. But anyway, these are the pathogens. Numbers of probability of pathogens, and they're very high. What the black lines represent are viable pathogens, pathogens that haven't been zapped by UV radiation. See, immediately, nature is great. Nature's doing great things for water quality. If we have more UV radiation, there's a lot of theory to show that would go a long way to controlling invasive species. But that's a story for another day. Very few viable pathogens, occurrences down here, lots more here, and especially as we get to the end. So why is that? This is a period of over 50 days, almost 2 months. This is water depth here. This red line is the depth of the intake. At the beginning, here in July, all the warm water is up here. This is all cold here. As we start going through summer, you see those things are coming down and down. When that surface water reaches the intake depth, that's suddenly when pathogens can get there. Okay. So again, this is model result. We're not measuring these temperatures. This is coming from the model. So this was really interesting to us. We actually, you can see for yourselves that if the intake depth was lower, then the occurrence of pathogens would be reduced. So this is, we're not recommending that this be done, but suddenly it becomes an option. That maybe changing the intake depth would avoid it. This is presuming full lake level. Right now, we're 2 meters down from full lake level. Next summer, we may be, I'm not going to say.
Full. Full.
Full. I hope we're full. I hope we're full.
So Jeff, on this model, does this assume that the pathogen release is continuous?
Good question. No, we actually, we make some assumptions. This was from Mike Anderson. There's a certain pathogen release number per person, an assumption of how many people are swimming, what hours of the day, more people at weekends, less during the week. And yeah, you would change those numbers, and the patterns don't change, but the magnitudes change.
But it's not a pulse release, it's going on for several weeks
Yeah.
and months, right?
Yeah, so this is releases every day, less during the week, more during the weekends.
Hey, Jeff, you said that around 1% of the pathogens survived the trip, or something like that. What is the probability of survival from the distance of where these things were released on the beaches to the intake? And how does it relate to the probability shown there in the middle graph?
Okay, the answer to the question is in the report, number one. Number two is, what we did, we made this assumption that after 24 hours, we only track the pathogens for 24 hours. We basically said, if after 24 hours they haven't gone in, then yeah, they're not going to make it there. So yeah, otherwise we'd be tracking this growing number of pathogens. But yeah, the UV inactivation is really potent. Yeah, I wish I could answer your question. I just can't remember the exact numbers you were asking, but they're in there. Okay. So just a slide here on. This was a question they said, but there's consideration of using herbicide to control invasive species or plants, what have you, at Tahoe Keys. The question was, well, what does this mean for everybody else? Now, I've got to give lots of caveats here. I have no idea what containment's going to be used. This is not taking any account of dilution. This is not taking any account of inactivation. It was just an exercise. It was an exercise not even to release sort of a dissolved herbicide, but again to release particles, just to see where would currents take them. And that's all we're doing. So what we did is every hour of the day for 10 days, we released 100 particles from this point, P1, and we tracked where they went for 24 hours, and when they got to the end of their track, we put a green dot there. So what you're seeing here, 24,000 green dots. And so we didn't bias it by just releasing them at 9 in the morning or 10 at night. It was every hour of the day for 10 days. And so what we saw was there seemed to be these three preferred pathways. Some particles headed west, some particles headed out towards deeper. This is actually, two of these look a lot like our drogues, actually. Head out across there, and there's another pathway going down in incredibly shallow water. This is the 2 meter contour, 6.5 feet. And so these things are just hugging the shore. What you could conclude from the point of view of, say, the water supplies in this area, is that within 24 hours, they are in the same area as, say, those beach areas where our studies commenced. So presumably, if something was there within hours, it could be at intakes. But again, something that is released is diluted, it may be a non-detectable number. Nobody's done that work, at least I haven't done that work. So, all right. So, started off saying we know very little about water motions in the near shore. What do we know about water quality in the near shore? Forget the motions, just what are the water quality conditions like? And historically, there hasn't been a lot of emphasis there. You know, the question always was, you know, how clear is it in the middle of the lake? And that's been where the interest was, and that's where the funding for science was. But I think in the last few years, there's been a change. I think agencies are more interested and keen to know what's happening. The public is certainly more interested in knowing what's there. We've all clambered over the rocks and they're slimy and the like. And I think with invasive species, essentially that's heightened people's concerns. So one of the things we've done is we've launched this, what we're calling this nearshore network. Basically, it's a neat concept. It's the idea of, well, we can monitor the quality of the nearshore in real time. It's not that hard to do. And it's the data that's, we're interested in, and we believe it's the data that's needed. So what you're seeing here is the nearshore divided up into little rectangles there. And we've approached people with access to lakefront property. We've approached people who want to fund something on a public dock. And we've asked them, would you support this? And to date, 6 have said, yes, we will. So we have stations at Rubicon, or in the Rubicon area, around Weeks Bay, Homewood, Dollar Point, or Cascade Lake as well as a reference. And we're just in the process of getting the permitting finalized for Sand Harbor, and we have putting in a control on one of our buoys out in the middle of the lake. So we have a way of comparing nearshore with mid-lake clarity. And it's actually pretty illuminating. So that's the thing. Okay, this is what the instrument package looks like. So it's, I guess, there's no scale there. It could be the size of this room. But it's actually about this long. Yeah, that's about 3 feet long. And this is sitting in 2 meters of water. It has a cable that goes back to the shore to somebody's private dock, where it's connected to power, and it has a cell modem, so data every 30 seconds is sent back to us. As I said, we have 5 operating, the 6th hopefully in the next couple of weeks. What does it measure? What measures sort of the things like temperature and depth. Actually, it does wave height. It does turbidity. It does the concentration of algae in the water. It does the dissolved organic material when algae break down. And you sort of start coloring the water. When you saw that picture of Marla Bay, it was very green. Part of that was this dissolved organic material. And what does the data look like? And I have no preconceived ideas of what this data would look like. So, and this is actually, I just grabbed this, we have this online now. It's available and there. So to see, so you're seeing just 2 things. This is from Dollar Point over here. So what we see, this is August, September, October. These data are measured every 30 seconds. And they're all displayed there. So what you're seeing, this wiggly line, is just the temperature, daytime, nighttime, daytime, night. Bit of a storm here. Lake temperature cooled a bit, but then it went back. Another storm, it cooled, another storm. This is turbidity, the cloudiness of the water. What you see, a lot of the time, it's really very low. Just above 0.2. It's great. That's why one of the reasons we love Tahoe. But what was interesting were these increases. Some were just tiny little, like a spike that, I don't know, may have been a crayfish just sitting in front of the sensor. Who knows? But some of these are prolonged. This one is, this is almost 2 days long. It goes up to a value of, well, the units of turbidity are sort of strange. But that's like 5 or 6 NTUs. TRPA current threshold for near shore clarity away from the stream is 1 NTU. So this was illuminated. Now, again, I'm not blaming anybody. When this was set, as you can tell, this was probably set 30 years ago in the absence of really knowing what it could be or should be or historically was. So one of the things we're finding out is, well, what's good, what's bad, and really, once we have all this in place, the understanding of, well, why is it bad? We know enough, we do the sampling of the attached algae 6 times a year. We know the area, that's a good area. We know the areas that are bad, more often than not. We don't know why they're bad. So what we're thinking is, once you can start tracking these things up the coast, down the coast, once you can start modeling them and actually seeing how this ties in with what's coming in from streams, what's coming in with drains, then you actually start to get the understanding. Not just knowing what's good and bad, but why it's good, why it's bad, what sort of levers the agencies have, what sort of actions should citizens be taking to improve these conditions.
Could some of that turbidity be linked to the corresponding storms?
Yeah, without a doubt. So, for example, this one, I mean, wherever you have these sharp dips, there was increases in turbidity, but there were some that weren't linked with that. And a lot of these storms some of them were just windstorms, no rains, and nothing's coming in, so this is resuspension of material. And again, from the point of view of a water supplier, resuspension of sediment is not a good thing. It's, you have a non-filtration exemption or filtration exemption here. The sediments, suddenly call that into question. Sediments are where you'd have contaminants attached to. You at least want to be aware of it, or the times when it's occurring. Okay, I think that's it. That's it.
Wow.
Thank you.